The night fell like a velvet curtain over Flatwoods as I stepped from the bus and tasted coal dust on the wind. I am Elliot Grant, and a rumor is a bell I must ring to hear its true tone. Mae Carter said, "You came for the fire in the sky, didn't you?" A red streak had slashed the horizon at dusk, and the town's heartbeat tripped. Sheriff Dalton muttered, "Kids swear it landed by the old hill." I carried my notebooks like armor and followed the hush toward the trees. Mae said, "Careful, the ground swallows stories, and men hear." A dog barked, and then refused to bark again, as if warned by something ancient. I said, "Truth prefers the dark, and I prefer truth." The first cricket stopped, and the second never began. The hill breathed, and I felt the breath hitch. We marked the circle's edge with string like surveyors of a bad dream, and the soil smelled faintly of metal. Mae said, "No one will thank you for finding this." I said, "The truth is thankless until it is necessary." Footprints broke the pattern, small and hurried, leading toward the trees like commas in a panic sentence. Sheriff Dalton said, "Boys came up here with a dog and a story." The dog would not cross the line, and neither would the crickets start their song. I knelt and felt a soft warmth under the surface, as if the hill remembered a touch. Mae said, "Things fall from the sky, and men call them monsters to make sense." I said, "Or men make monsters to hide what they know." We traced the small prints into the tree line, where the damp ferns kept their secrets. Mae said, "Kids chase light, adults chase reasons." The path tightened into a tunnel of sap and shadow. I said, "Reasons leave residue, and I am here to test for it." Dalton called out a name he would not repeat, and the name fell with the dew. A smell like burned oil mixed with crushed pine needles. Mae said, "If the papers get this, they will stitch panic into profit." I lifted my recorder and spoke a time and a set of coordinates. The woods listened as if they could sell my words back later. We found a branch seared smooth as bone, and the heat line ran straight as a ruler into the dark. Mae said, "Not lightning, not like this." I said, "A directed burn, shallow, deliberate." Dalton said, "I want to keep folks home tonight." Owls traded secrets above us and did not invite us in. My breath hit the cold like chalk marks on glass. Mae said, "If someone staged this, they knew their theater." I said, "Then the performance is not over." The wind raised the ash and set it drifting like gray snow. The hill opened to a second clearing where the air felt heavier, as if memory had mass. Mae said, "Do you hear that hum, or am I wanting to?" I said, "When you want to hear, you must check harder." Dalton said, "Tracks end here like they were lifted." A faint metallic scent laced the wind and turned my tongue to copper. I said, "We document, and we do not decide yet." Mae said, "Decisions happen to us anyway." I knelt, pressed my palm to the soil, and the hum became a feeling. The stars brightened as if waiting for a cue. Morning slid into Flatwoods like pale smoke, but the whispers carried sharper than any crow's cry. Mae said, "By noon everyone will swear the hill birthed a demon." I said, "Fear is a rumor's most loyal carrier." Dalton frowned and said, "Men at the diner already asked me why I kept the site unsealed." The papers from Charleston had phoned before dawn, pressing for names, dates, proof. Mae said, "Truth grows teeth when people taste a story they want." I sat with coffee untouched, pen scratching faster than thought, pages filling with shapes and timings. The town was no longer a quiet patch on the map, it was a mouth ready to chew itself. The whispers bent into claims of smoke that stung lungs, of eyes glowing above the ridge. Mae said, "A boy swore it hissed like a boiler ready to burst." Dalton muttered, "I'll hear nothing but tall tales until someone screams." I said, "Tales are stitched with threads of what was truly seen." Children pressed noses to glass, pointing at the hill, daring each other with stories older than them. My notes stacked like wood ready for fire, and still the fire burned louder. Mae said, "This is how a town writes its own legend." Dalton said, "Legends fill papers, but I have to quiet families. We left the diner, and the talk followed, words tumbling across sidewalks like loose nails. Mae said, "The hill is no longer a hill, it's a stage." Dalton said, "And every man is eager to play witness." I said, "Stages demand actors, and sometimes shadows volunteer." A woman on her porch swore she saw figures in uniforms walking up at dawn. Dalton tightened his jaw but said nothing. Mae whispered, "Uniforms mean government, and government means secrets." I said, "Secrets have keepers, and I came here to meet them." The silence that followed was heavier than any fog. By afternoon, the post office buzzed with men clutching letters and rumors alike. Mae said, "When the mail runs thick, so do the lies." I said, "Paper carries truth and falsehood with equal weight." Dalton said, "If reporters arrive, they'll eat us raw." I watched a boy slip a folded note under the counter, eyes darting as though chased by ghosts. Mae said, "That looked more like a warning than a love letter." I said, "Warnings wear plain paper and crooked hands." Dalton shook his head and muttered, "You'll drown in riddles before you drown in rain." The rain finally began. Night fell with heavy rain, and the whispers did not stop but grew sharper in the downpour. Mae said, "The louder the storm, the faster stories travel." Dalton said, "Rain douses fire, but it cannot quench lies." I said, "Storms only amplify what people fear most." We gathered under the porch of the boarding house, lantern flickering, each drop sounding like a clock tick. Mae said, "Tomorrow they'll swear the monster came down Main Street." I said, "Truth waits behind curtains, and storms only raise them." Dalton pulled his coat tighter, saying nothing, watching shadows climb the soaked hill. Morning returned gray and cold, but shadows stretched longer than they should. Mae said, "Something's shifting, and not just the weather." Dalton muttered, "Orders came last night, men in black cars." I said, "Then the keeper of secrets has arrived." The town square was no longer familiar. Government sedans lined the curbs like silent sentries. Men in suits walked with notebooks they would never share. Mae whispered, "You asked for truth, now it walks with polished shoes." Dalton said, "They told me to stand down." I said, "Secrets wear uniforms of silence, but silence is brittle." The air carried a weight that even rain could not cleanse. By noon the agents walked fields like farmers reaping fear. Mae said, "They look for what we already found." I said, "Or they bury it deeper." Dalton kept silent, his jaw locked against his orders. I asked one man in gray for his name, but he only smiled like marble and walked past. Mae whispered, "They are not here to answer. They are here to erase." The townsfolk leaned on porches, watching, whispering louder than yesterday. Dalton finally said, "We are bystanders now, and I hate it." I wrote faster, knowing every page might become evidence against forgetting. At dusk I sat on the courthouse steps, notebook heavy with unfinished sentences, as men carried boxes bound in coarse rope. Mae said, "What's inside?" I said, "What belongs to the past, repackaged as silence, and stored like contraband." Dalton lingered by the doors, guarding nothing his heart trusted, a hollow soldier of orders. A woman whispered of maps burned alive in the basement furnace, her voice brittle as glass. The hum of a truck engine rolled steady, louder than the crickets who had surrendered their song. Mae said, "You cannot outright a fire." I said, "Ash still speaks if you know the language of ruin." Dalton finally muttered, "You chase ghosts while the living drown." I said, "Ghosts keep the truth breathing longer than fear allows." The courthouse loomed like a mausoleum for secrets. Later, when the street lamps buzzed faint and moths circled their weak halos, a hand emerged from the shadows like a verdict. A stranger in a long coat pressed a folded paper into mine, voice low and foreign. He said, "Not all want silence." His words carried the weight of places I had never walked. Mae whispered, "Who is he?" I said, "The keeper of secrets always leaves cracks where light bleeds through." Dalton glared from the curb, law bending in him like a beam under too much weight. yet he spoke nothing. The paper trembled in my hand as if it held more than ink, as though it pulsed with what it concealed. Mae said, "You trust too fast." I said, "Trust is not what I seek, only pieces to assemble the shape of truth." The folded note smelled faintly of ash, rain, and something older. In my room by the boarding house lantern, I unwrapped the note with trembling hands. Its map, drawn in haste, carried a circle exactly where we had stood on the hill, as though someone had followed us step for step. Mae said, "They know we know." I said, "Then they watch as we dig deeper, waiting for us to choke on the dirt we uncover." Dalton knocked once at the door, his silence heavy as stone, a warning heavier than words. Outside, rain thickened against glass, each drop sounding like a clock that had run out of patience. Mae whispered, "You are writing yourself into their trap." I said, "Truth is the only trap worth entering." The lantern flame guttered and bent, as if the ink on the page pulled air toward itself. I felt the keeper's shadow leaning closer, vast and patient, like the night itself. The note's map led us deeper into the woods where silence had a body. Mae said, "You trust shadows too much." I said, "Shadows carry truth when light is stolen." Dalton muttered, "If this is a trap, I won't drag you out." The pines leaned like watchmen, dripping rain from the last storm. Ahead, lanterns burned low where no townfolk should walk. Mae whispered, "We are not alone." I said, "Then the play has begun." Dalton's hand rested on his revolver, but his eyes held no faith in bullets. I knew then that allies could mask themselves as enemies, and enemies as friends. From the fog stepped a man with polished charm and a smile built for trust. He said, "I've walked this path longer than you think." Mae whispered, "He knows too much." I said, "Knowledge offered freely is never free." Dalton growled, "State your purpose." The stranger replied, "I want what you want, to find the truth beneath the smoke." His words were silk, but his eyes glinted like knives. Mae said, "You believe him?" I said, "I believe he wants me to." The man extended a hand, and I took it, knowing betrayal often wears the firmest grip. The stranger guided us along a ridge where the ground was scarred in arcs. Mae said, "This is not found, this is staged." I said, "Every stage has an audience." Dalton muttered, "An actor's too willing to play roles." The man laughed softly, saying, "Call it what you like, but something landed here." His tone carried both truth and falsehood, stitched too neatly. Mae whispered, "He's leading us where he wants." I said, "Then let him, until his story frays." The ridge smelled faintly of iron and rain, a theater floor scrubbed clean for its next performance. Later, we paused by a fallen oak, where whispers clung thicker than fog. The stranger said, "You are not the first to hunt this." Mae said, "And what became of the others?" He smiled, "Forgotten, as all inconvenient truths are." Dalton spat into the dirt, saying, "You sound more like a jailer than a guide." I said, "Secrets don't vanish, they're buried alive." Mae whispered, "You walk closer to his game than you think." I said, "Better to walk it than be blindsided by it." The oak's hollow groaned, echoing like something breathing. When night deepened, a cloaked figure appeared at the tree line, neither friend nor foe, but something between. The informant said, "You are close to the mouth but not the heart." Mae whispered, "What mouth?" He answered only with silence, and vanished like mist. Dalton said, "You follow riddles, not facts." I said, "Riddles are facts in disguise." Mae shook her head, saying, "Each step makes truth heavier." I said, "Then I will carry it until it crushes me." The clearing seemed to pulse once, as if alive, and then stilled. Morning bleached the clouds, and the town exhaled only to inhale dread again. Mae said, "You look like you argued with sleep and lost." I said, "Sleep bargains with fools." Dalton said, "A woman asked for you by name." Her name carried grief like a bell, and it rang through the boarding house hall. She said, "My brother vanished the night the light fell." I said, tell me every step he took and every step you took after. Mae watched her hands tremble as if the story lived there. Dalton said, people disappear without monsters. I said, monsters are what we call the shape of absence. She unfolded a map creased by worry and pointed to a place the agents had fenced. Ruth said, Tommy ran out when the streak crossed the sky, and I followed the glow. Mae said, how far did you chase it? Ruth said, to the orchard, where the ground steamed. Dalton frowned and said, boys chase noise. I said, noise often leads to signal. Ruth drew a trembling line on my page and marked a tree with a scar. Mae said, the agents posted a guard there yesterday. Ruth whispered, they told me I misremembered. I said, memory is a room they like to rearrange. Dalton said, show us the scar before they move the tree too. Ruth nodded as if permission had weight, and it finally lifted. The orchard breathed sweet rot and rain memory, and the birds kept their counsel. Ruth said, here, where the apples fell out of season. I said, heat will ripen what time refuses. Dalton said, or a prankster with a torch. Mae knelt and brushed ash from a ring no one had raked. Ruth touched the scarred trunk and flinched as if it hummed. I said, your brother's prints. Dalton said, or everyone's. Mae said, look, small steps, then a drag. Ruth whispered, he hated the dark, but he ran into this one. I felt the truth lean closer, patient and unkind. A sedan eased to the lane, and the hidden enemy stepped out with a smile that sealed doors. He said, you are trespassing where nothing happened. Mae said, nothing leaves neat circles these days. Dalton stiffened, but said nothing, caught between duty and doubt. I said, Ruth's brother disappeared, and your circle speaks. He replied, stories swallow boys faster than hills. Ruth said, give me back our truth. He offered a card like a blade and said, let professionals handle it. I said, professionals broke the compass. The wind shifted and carried a chemical tang that did not belong. We walked Ruth home by twilight, and sorrow sat on her porch like an old friend. She said, Tommy carved stars into the railing to ward off night. Mae traced the cuts and said, he wanted light to follow him. Dalton stood on the steps and stared at the road, as if answers would arrive in parade. I said, we will return to the orchard at midnight. Ruth whispered, bring him back, or bring back what happened to him. I said, I can only bring back the shape of truth. Mae said, sometimes, that is all a heart can hold. The fireflies lit, and none crossed the yard. Midnight found us back at the orchard, where mist braided the rows into a single corridor. Mae said, if we walk in, we walk out changed. I said, change is the toll for truth. Dalton said, keep close and keep quiet. A second lantern bobbed ahead, and the hidden enemy waited as if he owned the dark. He said, you wanted proof, so I invited an expert. The expert stepped from the trees and smiled with a memory I knew. Mae whispered, you know him. I said, I did once. Samuel Hart said, old friend, let me help you finish this. My chest tightened around a decade of faith I had not tested. Samuel walked me between trees, where the ash ring still held its breath. He said, you always chase the wound, never the scar. I said, scars tell the direction of the blade. Mae shadowed us, silent as a verdict. Dalton stayed with the others, watching the lane for engines. Samuel said, agents will close this by dawn, but you can print the bones of it. I said, bones without marrow or theater. He lowered his voice and said, hand me your notes, and I will trade you a name. Mae hissed, he is buying your silence. I said, or renting my trust. In the hush, something metallic clicked behind his smile. Engines murmured, and two agents moved like punctuation at the edge of our sentence. The hidden enemy said, time is a fuse. Dalton said, stand down and speak straight. Ruth hurried from the lane, breath quick, clutching a small cloth bundle. She said, I found this near the creek where the drag marks end. I opened the cloth, and saw a pocketknife carved with stars. Mae, said Tommy, marked the railing with the same hand. Samuel said, boys drop trinkets to be found. I said, boys also leave maps when they need rescuing. The agents reached for my pages, and Dalton chose not to choose. Before the hands reached the paper, the informant stepped from the alder shadows. He said, you are measuring smoke and ignoring the furnace. Mae said, then show the heat. He dropped a dented meter that ticked like a second heartbeat. Dalton said, what am I looking at? The informant said, residual burn from a device they will never name. The hidden enemy smiled and said nothing, which answered more than words. Samuel whispered, this is theater for the gullible. I said, theater still leaves splinters when it collapses. The meter ticked faster when it faced the scar. Samuel reached for my notebook, as if rescuing it from me. He said, you will drown in this and call it truth. I said, you left me once for glory. Do not leave me now for fear. Mae said, choose Elliot and make it hurt them, not Ruth. The hidden enemy nodded toward the agents, and they moved. Dalton stepped between us and said, we do not burn what we have not read. Ruth set her hand on the knife and whispered, he needs to come home, even as a story. I tore the key pages free and shoved them into Mae's coat. Samuel said, this is your ruin. I said, it is my record. Dawn bled slow over Flatwoods, the mist on the ridge glowing like tired embers. Mae said, your words survived, Elliot, but will we? I said, we have the map, the knife, the meter's testimony, and the silence they cannot leash. Dalton muttered, they'll seal this hill before noon, chain it with files and signatures. The hidden enemy stood waiting near the roots, hands behind his back like a sermon prepared for control. Samuel said, end this clean, Elliot, or let it bury you. Ruth whispered, Tommy deserves a name, not a legend. I said, names are keys, myths are locks, today I turn both. The informant murmured, follow the burn line under the roots, it opens like a scar that remembers fire. The earth seemed to twitch beneath us, as if something below stirred and heard its own verdict rising. We dug where the ash clung to the roots, soil damp and unwilling to give. Beneath lay a scorched metal shell, its edges curled like pages in a fire. Mae said, not a ship, not the monster they whisper. I said, it is a machine, or the bones of theater staged for belief. Dalton said, then fear was pointed at us like a rifle sight. The informant murmured, military scrap, a project erased before it was ever born. The hidden enemy smiled faint, see, a prank inflated until panic swallowed your town whole. Ruth touched the shell, and flinched as heat lived in it still. She whispered, Tommy followed this glow into dark. Samuel said, print this and stop. I said, I will print who lit the match as well as what burned. The air held the scent of iron, ash, and secrecy. We followed drag lines toward the creek, where oil shimmered rainbow across the current. Mae said, they carried it here, piece by piece, careful as priests. I said, then someone curated terror, wrapped it in ritual. Dalton said, say their name, Elliot. The informant said, a test unit from a project that never existed in ink. The hidden enemy snapped, careful, name stain, more than uniforms. Samuel said, Elliot, you will drown in enemies if you write this. Ruth clutched her brother's knife and whispered, who erased him if not the hill's shadow? I said, maybe no monster ate him, but a story did, and stories leave sharper teeth than beasts. Silence rose heavy as fog. Engines rolled over gravel, and agents stepped with papers that cracked like chains. Mae said, they will fold this into a file that no one reads. Ah. Dalton stepped forward saying, not before we finish the search. The hidden enemy's voice oiled, Sheriff, this rises above you. Samuel said, stand aside, Elliot, before you are broken in it. I said, I stood aside once and silence lasted 10 years too long. Ruth dropped to her knees at the scarred pit and whispered, Tommy left stars to be found, not erased. The informant breathed, look deeper under the shell. My hand dug, mud thick, and a chain glinted. A dog tag clung to roots like it resisted discovery, letters blurred but name intact. The hill held its breath. The tag bore not Tommy's name but a soldier's, unclaimed and forgotten. Mae whispered, "The monster devoured a man built from orders." I said, "A crash, a cover, and a fable to shield power while feeding panic." Dalton said, "We tell Ruth the truth that wounds but heals." The hidden enemy sneered, "Print it, and be erased." Samuel said, "Or print it, and finally be seen." Ruth pressed the pocketknife against her chest and said, "I will carry both my brother and this lost soldier." I said, "Then I will write the monster not as alien, but as mirror, and the mirror as ours." The wind skimmed over the ridge and carried away silence, leaving nothing but air and truth we could no longer bury.